Welcome to the June 16th update of the IHME COVID-19 forecasting model. My name is Alan Featherstone. This work is done with Jonathan Featherstone and Julia Maddock. What we're going to look at today is look at the revisions in the model since June 9th. We're going to look at Kansas and the U.S. mortality statistics. We're going to also take a look at what's changed in the last week. We will give some discussion with regards to social distancing by state. We'll then quickly look at the distribution of daily deaths compared to the original model. And then we will look at cumulative deaths compared to the March 26 model. Again, the COVID-19 coronavirus is having a major effect on the U.S. economy, with the unemployment rate being at 13%. Since the middle of March, roughly 44 million U.S. workers have filed for unemployment. This represents roughly 25% of the U.S. economy. The Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, their model, continues to play an important role. You have the website there if you want to take a look at the information on the website. The key thing is that it is involved in the formulation of policy, and essentially it does have a large role. What we're trying to do here is just provide an ex post performance of the model, look at the periodic revisions and determine whether or not they have improved the prediction or not. This is an update of the June 9th discussion. The model, the last major changes occurred on May 29th. Essentially the information is there. Probably the couple key points here that are looking at is that essentially the major change from last week is the updated data. One of the things that we're not going to cover here is the model is starting to go out to October with regards to the predictions. The previous models ended at roughly August 4th, and we will do that probably for this week. I don't know what we'll do next week, if we'll go further or not. Part of it is just the comparison window is much easier to make with regards to everything ending at August 4th. It is important to realize that the paper still is in the peer review process. Again, we've looked at these numbers for the last few weeks. In Kansas, Kansas experienced 9 total deaths from the previous week. Last week it was at 236. This week it's at 245. One of the things you'll see is over the last couple weeks we have had deaths in the 25 to 34 range, and certainly those are the first deaths experienced in Kansas roughly over the last couple of weeks. In terms of looking at the distribution, the key thing is generally it matches pretty well. Probably the big comparison is at the older age ranges. The death rate has been a little bit higher from COVID than it was in 2018 as a whole. And then also a little bit higher mortality rate, kind of actually in the 45 to the 74 range than what is normally experienced. And so those populations are in Kansas being hit a little harder. In terms of the U.S., looking at these, again, the same type of thing in terms of the older age ranges, 65 to 85 plus. You see a little bit more death. If you look at the younger age ranges, you see a little less. And so, again, it seems like the distribution is a little bit heavier on the older age groups. Another thing I think that's important to look at is the total deaths reported by the CDC are 95,000. You see death rates nearing 120,000 in other groups. Part of that may be the lag of reporting. Part of that may be just to the definition of death. The other thing I think is important to look at is the death rate per thousand. I think one of the things to look at is all these numbers in Kansas are obviously quite a bit lower than they are for the mortality rate per 1,000. And several of these are on the order of 1 in 100. And so essentially, while the COVID pandemic certainly has affected individuals, now with 3 months in, essentially you could multiply these by 4 to kind of get the annual death rate per 1,000. And again, while every death is important, it's quite a bit less. And you can also look at these from the U.S. perspective. Again, you could multiply these by 4, at which point there'd be 20 deaths in the 85 plus range. Normally in a year you would see about 136, and so you could argue whether or not it's fair to just multiply those by 4. There may be some seasonality that certainly is unknown at this point in time, whether or not that will occur. This looks at the original model, the model for 329, looking at the mean deaths per day. And then I've updated this for the 6th, release on the 6th, the release on the 8th, and the release on the 13th. If you look at the U.S. numbers in terms of last week, we were at the blue line there, and essentially the middle of the week, actually in the U.S. as a whole, it looked like the daily death rate was going down, but then with the revision, you see that the daily death rate increased from below 500 per day as we get into the middle to end of July period into August to above 500 at this period in time. And so again, the model has become more pessimistic with regards to the daily death for the U.S. You can then look at this on the cumulative death rate, and you can see that essentially it's up about 145, 148,000 with regards to the expectation as of August 4th, 2020. You can look at Kansas. Last week at this point in time, we're on this blue line where it looked like the model was exploding. The last 2 runs of the model, basically, while it did increase a little bit, the key thing to realize there is that through the 4th of October, the daily death rate is going to hover around 2 per day in Kansas, and then is expected to decrease below 2 per day at a very slow rate. And that's probably one of the things that's changing all these models, is that essentially the going to 0 just isn't occurring like was originally forecast. Again, looking at this within Kansas, essentially it dropped to the red and then increased to the green. But again, quite a bit less death than projected last week at this time. Last week at this time it was up around 480. Now it's in the low 300s, 320, 330, in that range. New York, one of the things with regards to New York is that on the daily death model, it doesn't change much, and the same type with regards to the cumulative models. Again, you're in the 32, 33,000 range with regards to the estimates, but on a percentage basis, very little change. California, in terms of looking at this, again, from last week, the expectation is a little higher by the first part of August. Originally, it was projecting less than 60 1 week ago. Now it's reporting or estimating more than 60 deaths per day. And again, you can look at this, you can see in some respects the model is about where it was a week ago, although towards the end of last week there was an expectation that the death rate from a cumulative perspective would be less. Florida, in terms of one of the things with regards to Florida, is the blue and red lines were very close there. somewhere between 25 and 30 deaths per day. That now has really exploded such that the expectation is 100 deaths per day. One of the things to note is that this projection on this model is way out of any of what's been experienced in terms of, if you kind of look at the purple lines there, they're all below 100, and so essentially this model now is forecasting to see Florida experience a worse situation than they have through the first 3 months of the pandemic. And again, you can kind of look at how that revision has occurred. Illinois, in some respects, not a big change from a week ago. Again, the end of the week model last week was a little bit better, and then essentially the first part of this week it increased a little bit. And again, you can see from an Illinois perspective, the models are not adjusting greatly, at least over the last week. That's not quite the case in Texas. In terms of Texas, it was up quite high, then it dropped in the middle last week, and now it's up again, looking at 35 or 25 to 30 deaths per day, and then you can end up taking a look at that with regards to what's occurred over the last week. In terms of the next thing we want to look at is gathering and social distancing. In terms of looking at this, Alabama, since last week, basically eliminated any business closures. In terms of looking at some of the other changes that have occurred in June, essentially Iowa eliminated business closures. Maryland eliminated business closures. Delaware eliminated the stay-at-home in June 1. Michigan, stay-at-home was relaxed June 1. New Jersey, stay-at-home was relaxed June 9th. Montana pretty much opened everything up. Minnesota relaxed business closure as of June 10. June 5th, Pennsylvania relaxed the stay-at-home. And so you can see that there is some opening throughout the country with some of these occurring in June. To maybe summarize this, there's 8 states that still have stay-at-home orders. Those are California, Hawaii, Illinois, Maryland, New Hampshire, New York, Oregon, and Washington. And then there's 5 states that have relaxed all restrictions excluding education. Those would be Alaska, Arizona, Montana, Oklahoma, and South Dakota. And so that has not changed over the last week. The next thing we'll do is quickly go through the results. Again, in the U.S., you can see this downward trend over the last week. Certainly it seems to have a weekly cycle to it. In Kansas, again, a lot of bumpiness here. We already discussed that there were 9 deaths in Kansas over time. Again, the up and down that we've seen over this is just due to the reporting every other day, and then having 2 days not reported over the weekend. Colorado, again, seems to have flattened out over the last couple weeks. First part of June, it seems that the fluctuation is between up to 20 deaths per day. In Nebraska, there was a spike here, although certainly there were some 0 reported deaths there. It'll be interesting to see over the next week whether or not that begins to flatten in Nebraska. Missouri, again, seems to be relatively flat over the last week or so. Oklahoma, again, has a very low level of daily death, kind of fluctuating in the 0 to 5. The last couple days it was 0. New York tends to be on their downward trend, it continues to move lower. Same type of with New Jersey in terms of if you look at that, certainly over the month of June, it seems to at least have flattened and may continue its downward trend. Connecticut also seems to be on a downward trend. Massachusetts, again, downward trend. Again, a little bit of reporting differences there where it was very close to zero and then it bounced up. If you would look at the average there, you would see that that would be somewhat downward. Again, Maryland certainly on that downward trend. Delaware, in terms of there were 25 deaths reported there. This number here goes off the scale is actually negative 24 deaths, and so certainly some reporting issues there with regards to Delaware, but again, you see a downward trend. A lot of variability in Rhode Island. Again, it does seem like long term there is a downward sloping trend. Same with New Hampshire. Again, Vermont, essentially since the end of May, they have not reported a death, and so they're over 2 weeks without a death. Maine tends to be very, very low, doing very well. Pennsylvania, again, looks like with some seasonality in there, there still are weekly periods there. It seems like there is that downward trend. Same for Ohio. Michigan had a fairly downward trend, although there were a few spikes here in the last week or so. Indiana continues its downward trend. Illinois, again, some spikes with regards to reporting, but again, if you look at a longer term trend, it's certainly downward. Iowa basically has a downward trend since the end of May. Looks like Minnesota is beginning to see a downward trend here in terms of over the last week and a half. Wisconsin tends to do fairly well. Florida continues its flat trend. Again, certainly there were concerns with regards to Florida opening it up, but again, you really haven't seen any spike in death over the period of relaxed social distancing. Georgia does seem to have some variability. There was a bit of a spike at the beginning of the week, but then some fairly low results towards the end of the week. South Carolina, again, over the last 3 weeks, seems to have a downward trend. A little flatter in North Carolina. Virginia looks pretty flat, and in some respects, certainly once the beginning of the June occurred, Virginia has kind of moved out of that 20 to 40 range and more in the 5 to 20 range with regards to daily deaths. West Virginia continues to be doing well. Kentucky, a lot of bouncing around, could be certainly with reporting, but again, it does seem that there's a downward trend there. Less so in Tennessee, in terms of Tennessee has been flat, maybe even a little bit of upward trend there. Alabama tends to be fairly flat. Mississippi, fairly flat. Louisiana seems to be continuing a downward trend since the 1st of June. A lot of variability around Arkansas, up to 10 deaths at the 1st of June, but dropping over the last week. Texas looks like that continues a slight downward trend there. In terms of, again, likely reporting differences in New Mexico, if you would average those out, certainly it would be continuing the trend. Arizona, in some respects, seems to be on a fairly steady situation. There doesn't seem to be the downward trend in Arizona as other states. Utah seems to be fairly flat, kind of in that 0 to 5. Again, there were an uptick at the end of last week, but the last day or so, it's kind of again fallen to zero. Could be a reporting issue there. Wyoming, essentially their last death was around the 10th of June, and so very, very flat. Montana, very, very flat in terms of in North Dakota. Certainly there was some spikes here at the beginning of June, but over the last week or so, it's been very flat. Same with South Dakota. Some spikes with regards to up to 4 deaths, but over the last half a week, that number has dropped off. Idaho is fairly flat. Nevada, fairly flat. California, perhaps a bit of a downward trend, perhaps flat, but again, they had been doing fairly well, kind of in this period here. In this period here, they just haven't seen the reduction that other states have had. Oregon seems to be fairly flat throughout June, and Washington, again, fairly flat over the first part of June. Alaska had a couple deaths in the last week, and in Hawaii, again, they've been doing well. Since the first part of May, they've been without a death due to COVID. This here slide looks at what's happened last week. We're on 6/8, and so if you want to compare what's happened in the last week, you'll see that the expectation by August 4th for Alabama has almost doubled. Alaska went from 11 to 19, also a doubling, but a much lower scale than Alabama. Arizona, prediction's a little better. Arkansas is a little better. California, about the same. Colorado, a little bit worse. Connecticut, about the same. Delaware, a little worse. And so you can kind of go through those, focusing on Kansas. Essentially, Kansas has seen a drop over the last week from about 470 to 340. You can go and look at the original models there and see how far those models were off on the August 4th cumulative death rate. In terms of looking at some other states, in terms of Minnesota, kind of where it's been over the last week is pretty flat, very close to the original estimate on the 4th. Montana, again, quite a bit below. And so you can see differences with regards to states, differences that have been hit a lot harder. Pennsylvania, Ohio were from the original projections. New York was from the original projections, but it does give you a little bit of a picture. And again, if you want to take a look at these slides, they are available on agmanager.info. U.S. as a whole, the original projection as of May 26th was 82,000. A week ago it was 146. A couple days later they released a new model where it was 139, and now from 6:15 it's jumped up to about 150,000. In terms of maybe to summarize, and we thank you for your attention, this model continues to be revised out of the University of Washington. The thing is this model is still being used for policy decisions. It has resulted or looked at large negative economic effects for the ag economy. Last week, this was 10 states do not have stay-at-home orders. This dropped by 2 states, and so 8 out of the 50 states have stay-home orders, and 42 now do not. The distribution of death for COVID-19 is not substantially different from the distribution of death from all causes, and so while it does hit the older group a little bit heavier, it's surprisingly not distinct from the distribution of all deaths. In terms of looking at this, essentially the expected death over the last week increased in 28 states, fell in 22 states. And then the revisions released on June 15th, if we go back to the original model, this last week, 27 states have a higher cumulative death than what was in the original model, and 23 states have a lower death. The U.S. has a substantially higher model, and those many states that have higher expected death projections by August 4th have quite a bit higher expected deaths. But hopefully you found this to be beneficial. I also have the cumulative slides, and so again, if you want to download these slides, they are available at eggmanager.info. Again, hopefully this has been useful to you, and we will see you next week.